At the edge of the high desert, where winter pressed its pale thumb against the land, a lone cowboy stood before a barn that no longer felt like his own. The boards were split from years of sun and frost. Their nails rusted into silence, and the door sagged as if tired of holding itself upright. Ezra Cole rested one gloved hand against it and listened, not for danger, but for proof that something in his life still answered when called. The night was thinning into dawn, that uncertain hour the old-timers said belonged to neither God nor man. Frost silvered the ground, and the breath from Ezra's lungs drifted away like a thought he could not finish. He had not slept. Sleep had grown unfamiliar since the cattle auction in Abilene, since numbers spoken aloud had undone 3 generations of work. The ranch was still here, but its future had slipped off somewhere in the dark. Ezra was not a young man, though the land had aged him faster than time alone. His face carried the quiet damage of wind and regret, lines cut deep by decisions made when there had been no good ones to choose from. His father had built this place with hands that believed endurance was a form of faith. His mother had died believing the same. Ezra had stayed because leaving felt like a betrayal worse than failure. The barn had once been full of sound. Horses shifting in their stalls, cattle lowing at dusk, iron tools clinking as work went on late into the evening. Now it was mostly empty space and memory. Ezra had sold off what he could without breaking his word to himself. What remained was enough to keep the place breathing, but not enough to promise survival through another winter. He had come this morning to make a decision. Not a dramatic one, not the kind folks talk about later, but the small, heavy kind that settles in a man's chest and stays there. If the barn was to be closed for good, it would be done before the sun cleared the ridge. He told himself this was mercy. Empty buildings do not freeze. Animals do. Ezra reached for the latch, feeling the cold through his glove, and paused. Something moved on the other side. It was not the restless scrape of wind-blown debris, nor the sharp sound of a predator testing wood. It was softer, a sound shaped by breath and patience. The kind of sound a living thing makes when it has learned that calling too loudly brings no help. He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the door. It would carry the chill straight into his bones. There was again a low, uneven exhale, then another, answering it. Ezra straightened, his heart tightening in a way he had not felt since the night his last horse died in his arms, knees folding gently into the dirt as if kneeling was the only way left to be. No one was supposed to be here. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles off, and travelers avoided this stretch of land in winter unless they had no other choice. Ezra thought of the stories his father used to tell, of strays and lost men and animals that followed old trails long after the reason for them had vanished. The desert, his father said, remembered everything. The latch lifted with a dry click that sounded too loud in the quiet morning. Ezra pulled the door open just enough to let a blade of gray light slip inside. Cold rushed out, sharp and animal, carrying with it the smell of sweat, dust, and something older, something worn down to its last usefulness. Shapes emerged slowly, as if the darkness were reluctant to let them go. 8 donkeys stood huddled together, heads low, their bodies drawn inward against the cold. Ice clung to their coats. Frayed ropes hung from their sides, stiff with frost. They did not scatter or shy away. They stood as if waiting for instruction that had not yet arrived. Ezra counted them twice, because the number felt deliberate, like a message he did not yet understand. For a long moment, no one moved. Ezra felt the weight of the choice settling fully now. He could close the door. He could tell himself this was not his burden, not his failing. The land had already taken enough from him. But as he stood there, watching their breath cloud the dim air, he understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever he was about to lose or save, this moment would decide who he was when the sun finally rose. He did not know then where the donkeys had come from, or why they had chosen this failing ranch over the open desert that would have killed them just as surely. He only knew that their presence pressed against him like a hand at his back, steady and insistent. Ezra thought of his father again, of the way the old man used to say that responsibility was rarely loud when it arrived. It came quiet, wearing another face, asking to be let inside. Ezra drew the door wider, the hinges protesting, and stepped aside. The cold followed him in, but so did something else, something heavier than fear and harder to name. Outside, the first edge of sunlight touched the ridge, pale and uncertain, as if the day itself was waiting to see what kind of man would stand in this doorway. He understood, without yet understanding why, that once the door was open it would not close the same way again. Whatever lay ahead would demand more than feed or shelter. It would demand that he remember what staying had always meant. And in the thin morning light, that memory began to stir, uneasy but alive. It was the same feeling that had kept him here when leaving would have been easier and far less lonely than this moment promised him. Ezra did not move for a long while after opening the door. He stood aside, letting the cold spill around his legs, studying the 8 shapes as they slowly understood that the darkness had shifted. One donkey lifted its head first, ears twitching, eyes pale with exhaustion. It did not bray or step forward. It only breathed, shallow and controlled, as if sound itself had once been punished out of it. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, not all the way, just enough to cut the wind. The barn creaked softly, the sound familiar and strangely comforting. Ezra reached up and lit the lantern hanging from a nail. The flame caught, throwing amber light across the dirt floor and the animals standing upon it. In that glow, the donkeys looked older than they should have been, their hides marked by long use and longer neglect. They were packed close, flank to flank, as if warmth were something that could be remembered into existence. Each wore a harness rubbed thin at the shoulder. The leather was cracked, mended with knots that spoke of haste and little care. Ezra took another step, slow and open-handed, the way his father had taught him when approaching nervous stock. None of them shied away. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He reached the nearest animal and laid his palm against its neck. The flesh beneath was rigid with cold. The donkey did not flinch. It leaned, just barely, into the pressure, like a thing that had learned help came rarely and never lasted. Ezra swallowed, the tightness in his throat sharp enough to ache. He moved down the line, touching each in turn, counting again, confirming they were real. Only then did he notice what they carried. Canvas bundles hung from each side, tied with careful symmetry, the weight balanced by someone who understood animals well enough to use them without mercy. The cloth was stiff with frost, the knots frozen solid. Ezra bent and pressed his fingers against one bundle. It was heavy, but not with or a grain. It shifted slightly under his touch, settling as if layered by intention. The donkeys watched him closely now. Their eyes followed his movements, not with fear, but with a weary attentiveness that made his chest feel crowded. Ezra straightened and looked around the barn. There was hay enough for a few days, water if he broke the ice in the trough. He had planned to sell what remained come spring, if spring came kindly. He had not planned for this. He cut the first knot with his knife, the blade dull but willing. The rope fell away, thudding softly into the dirt. He eased the bundle down and opened it just enough to see inside. His breath caught. Canned food, bandages, small jars wrapped in cloth, a folded blanket with a child's name stitched into one corner. Ezra closed the flap and sat back on his heels, the lantern light trembling slightly with his hand. These were not the trappings of trade. No brand, no claim of ownership. They were supplies meant to be delivered, carried far enough that wagons no longer went. Ezra had heard talk in town of relief shipments bound for settlements along the border, of contracts handed out cheap to men who promised much and delivered little. He had not thought those stories would find him here, standing in his failing barn. He worked quietly then, cutting straps, easing the loads down one by one. As each donkey was unburdened, it shifted, hooves scraping softly, bodies loosening with cautious relief. One shook itself, sending a dusting of frost into the air. Another lowered its head and nudged the empty space where weight had rested too long. Ezra spoke to them under his breath, words without shape, meant only to fill the silence. When the last bundle lay on the ground, Ezra stepped back and surveyed the scene. 8 animals stood lighter now, but no less uncertain. They did not rush the hay or the water. They waited. He broke the ice in the trough and stepped away. Only then did the nearest donkey move, lowering its head to drink, stopping twice as if expecting interruption. The others followed, careful and orderly. Ezra leaned against a post and watched, his mind turning over possibilities he did not yet want to name. Whoever had sent them had not planned to come back. Whoever had used them had counted on distance and cold to finish what indifference had begun. Ezra felt anger stir, slow and deliberate, but beneath it was something heavier. Responsibility, settling in the way his father had warned him it always did. Outside, the sun climbed higher, thin light spilling through the gaps in the boards. The barn looked different now, less like a relic waiting to be closed and more like a place that had been chosen. Ezra rubbed his hands together, feeling the ache return to his fingers, and knew with a clarity that surprised him that he could not turn away from this. Not after seeing what had been carried here. Not after being chosen, whether by chance or by need. He did not yet know what would be asked of him, or what it might cost. He only knew the donkeys had come this far because they were made to, and they had stopped because something in them understood this place might hold. Ezra straightened, set his shoulders, and reached for another knife to cut the remaining frozen straps. The choice, once made, settled into him like a vow, quiet and binding, and the barn, long emptied of purpose, drew breath again as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Ezra spent the morning tending to the donkeys with a deliberate quietness, moving from stall to stall, loosening halters, rubbing frost from their coats, and listening to their careful, measured breaths. Each exhale was a story, a ledger of distance traveled, burdens carried, and nights endured without shelter. As the animals ate from the hay he had warmed with his hands, he began to examine the bundles left behind, the cargo that had first startled him with its quiet insistence. One by one, he unfolded them, revealing a pattern that made the hairs along his neck rise. It was not random. Every bundle contained provisions meant for someone, somewhere, along a route long abandoned. Simple items, food staples, bandages, a few carefully wrapped personal effects, had been packed with precision, each label burned or worn away, leaving only the ghost of a name. Ezra recognized handwriting from a supplier in Santa Fe, a local contractor who had boasted of getting the job done cheaper, faster at town meetings. There were no invoices, no receipts, just the evidence of care given under duress, carried miles by creatures strong enough to bear it, yet left to shiver at the mercy of frost and night. Ezra walked outside, boots crunching on frost-crusted earth, and squinted at the horizon. The winter sun lay low, pale over the high plains, and the wind pressed against him like a warning. He thought of the journey the donkeys must have taken, through passes no wagon dared, along ridges where snow drifts swallowed footprints. The animals had come without guidance beyond instinct, survival, and some faint understanding of human intent. And yet they had arrived at his door, unclaimed by those who should have cared. Back in the barn, Ezra gathered the evidence into neat piles. There were maps, smudged, burned at the edges, showing settlements where aid was meant to reach. Some bundles held cloth stitched with names, children's names, faded into anonymity through distance. Others contained letters, folded into tiny squares, written in a hurried hand, the ink smeared from moisture. Whoever had packed them had intended these items for people, not profit. Whoever had sent the donkeys had chosen them to bear the weight. Whoever had profited had left them to die. Ezra's hands trembled, not from cold but from the weight of understanding. He had seen cruelty before, theft in the markets, cattle run off by neighboring ranchers, disputes over water and grazing land. But this was a system deliberate in its indifference, using animals as instruments and letting the helpless carry the cost. And yet the cruelty had a human face somewhere. Someone had made a choice to exploit the donkey's endurance, to count them as expendable, and in doing so, betrayed a network of trust meant to reach those in need. He spoke to the donkeys softly, words without expectation of reply. "You've done more than anyone asked," he said. "You've carried more than they thought you could." The largest one, a gray mare with a white streak across her forehead, lifted her head and met his gaze. In that look, Ezra saw comprehension, not gratitude. He had learned animals rarely give thanks, but a quiet acknowledgement of shared struggle. The mare shifted her weight, stirring the others to movement, and they settled again, as if agreeing on the lesson that suffering could be endured and sometimes recognized. Ezra left the barn to seek answers. He rode slowly toward the nearest town, the wind tearing across the saddle, carrying with it a scent of frost and urgency. In the office of the supply contractor, he found records that were incomplete, hastily burned edges hinting at secrecy. The clerk, an old man with hands tremulous from years in gin, muttered about shipments going off the rails, about men who had taken their own shortcuts and left the animals to fend for themselves. No one had asked questions beyond profit. No one had cared to track what survived the journey. The ledger was full of numbers, but empty of humanity. Ezra understood, now, the scale of negligence. He returned to the barn that evening, lanterns swinging from a nail above the door, and felt the weight of the day press against him. The donkeys were calmer now, heads resting lightly, eyes dim but steady, chewing slowly, digesting both food and the strange reassurance of safety. Ezra moved among them, checking legs, rubbing noses, loosening blankets, and he noticed a small detail that tightened the knot of realization in his chest. One of the bundles contained a faded photograph of a boy, perhaps 7 or 8, holding a small donkey of his own. The edges were frayed, the image blurred, but the intent was clear. These animals had carried not just supplies, but the hope of human lives depending on them. Night fell fully, and Ezra lit the stove in the corner, letting warmth spill into the barn, wrapping the animals in its muted glow. He sat on the hay-strewn floor, reviewing the bundles, the maps, the letters. Each artifact whispered a fragment of the story: neglect, desperation, endurance, and the unasked question of why anyone had thought it acceptable to leave them to wander through the cold. The donkeys, huddled together, seemed to listen in their quiet, deliberate way, as if understanding the gravity of their unintended witness. Ezra realized that the journey was not over. The evidence in his hands, the truth carried by the animals, demanded action. He could not simply feed and shelter them, then let the story fade with the morning light. He had to trace the path, to see who had made these choices, who had profited from them, and whether justice, or even acknowledgement, could reach the other end of the road. This was no longer about animals alone. It was about a chain of cruelty that had gone unnoticed because no one had looked closely enough. He stepped outside into the pale dawn, lantern swinging, and surveyed the barn as it breathed quietly around the donkeys. The first frost of winter had begun to melt, steam rising where their bodies had pressed against the earth. Ezra's resolve settled in his chest, slow and steady, the kind of resolve that came not from heroics, but necessity. Whoever had sent the animals, whoever had used them, whoever had expected them to fail, had underestimated the quiet determination of a man who would not turn away when the weight of truth arrived on his doorstep. And in that moment, as the sun touched the ridges with faint gold, Ezra knew the next steps would be difficult, maybe dangerous, certainly exhausting. But the animals had carried more than he could have imagined, and he could not now refuse to carry the truth that came with them. In the hushed light, with 8 pairs of eyes watching, he promised silently to follow the trail wherever it led, and to confront whatever hidden cruelty had sent these 8 creatures shivering into the snow, trusting that he would not fail them where others had. Ezra awoke before dawn, the barn silent except for the soft, even breaths of the 8 donkeys nestled in the hay. Outside, the wind tugged at the rafters, carrying frost across the plains like a cold whisper, but inside the barn, warmth had taken root. He moved slowly among the animals, checking legs, ears, eyes, each careful touch a measure of both relief and lingering unease. The morning light had not yet claimed the horizon, and Ezra felt the weight of what was to come pressing into his chest, steady and unyielding. He had spent the night going over the evidence again. The burned edges of maps, letters with names smudged into illegibility, bundles of supplies meant for children, widows, families who had never received them. And then there were the traces of neglect, the frayed ropes, the stiff leather, the frozen footprints in the snow that led him here but did not lead him back. He knew now that the contractor who had orchestrated these shipments had done more than cheat the animals. He had stolen hope, one frozen mile at a time. By first light, Ezra was on the trail. He rode slowly, boots in the stirrups, reins loose but steady, following the path the donkeys must have taken. Tracks in the snow were faint but persistent, winding through gullies and over ridges where the wind had tried to erase them. Each turn revealed more evidence. Broken crates, scattered cloth, hoof prints alongside tire marks, as if the machinery of greed had been clumsy enough to leave a trace. Ezra felt a fierce patience settle in him, the kind of patience that had sustained him through droughts, failed auctions, and nights spent watching dying fires in the stove. This patience was moral as much as it was practical. It demanded that he follow the trail, not in anger, but in observation, letting the truth speak for itself. By mid-morning, he reached the edge of a small town. It was silent in winter's grip, the few shop windows shuttered, streets empty except for the occasional scuff of boots across snow. Ezra dismounted and entered the supply office, the door swinging with a hollow clang. Behind the counter, a clerk looked up, startled, then wary. Ezra laid the maps, bundles, and letters on the desk, each one a quiet accusation. "These came through your hands," he said simply, "and they never reached the people they were meant for." The clerk's eyes darted to the piles and then away. I don't know what you mean," he said, voice thin, like a rope stretched too far. Ezra studied him, noticing the trembling in his hands, the lines of worry etched too deeply for someone of his age. The clerk had known, somehow, and yet had not acted. He had chosen the easier path, silence. Ezra pressed on, pointing out the burned edges, the missing invoices, the bundles abandoned in barns along the trail. "Someone profited," he said, "and someone paid the cost. These animals and the families waiting for this aid." The clerk could not meet his eyes. Ezra left without another word, the winter sun low and pale behind him. He had what he needed: proof, records, and the burden of moral obligation. Now he had to deliver it where it mattered. The courthouse in the next county was small, a single-story brick building with frost along its sills. Ezra laid out the evidence before the judge, his voice measured, not pleading, not angry, simply recounting facts. Letters, photographs, maps, and the testimony of the land and animals themselves. The donkey's journey had been arduous, precise, and deliberate. They had witnessed everything, and Ezra's evidence carried their silent narrative. The judge studied the bundles, flipping through maps and letters, noting the burned edges and frayed bindings. Ezra's description of the animal's condition and the path they had taken left a quiet weight in the room, heavier than any argument the contractor might have prepared. The law moved slowly, as it always does, but the moral truth is rarely as patient, and this one had followed Ezra to the courthouse like a shadow that would not disperse. By the afternoon, the contractor had no words left, no papers to shield him. The judge pronounced responsibility, not vengeance, but accountability, restitution to the families, care for the animals, and penalties for negligence so severe that others would take notice. Back at the ranch, Ezra opened the barn fully for the first time in months. The donkeys stepped in cautiously, sniffing the hay, lowering their heads to the water he had broken the ice for. One by one, they moved lighter now, their burdens gone, their eyes reflecting the steady warmth of a place that had become sanctuary. Ezra watched them, noting the subtle shift in their posture, no longer waiting, no longer bracing for absence or betrayal. The barn had been chosen as a place of rest, not by accident, but because Ezra had refused to turn away. Weeks passed, and the ranch changed in ways small but profound. Ezra repaired fences, replenished the feed, and created shelter for the animals he had once planned to abandon. The community, once skeptical of the aging rancher who had seen better days, began to recognize the purpose his place had found. Families came, quietly and humbly, bringing children who had once known hunger and uncertainty. Ezra met them with measured eyes and steady hands, offering a barn warmed by straw, kindness, and the quiet authority of someone who had seen cruelty and chosen compassion instead. The donkeys thrived, freed from both burden and fear. The gray mare with the white streak, who had first acknowledged Ezra with a glance, became a steady companion, moving among the other animals with calm authority. Each carried no more than the weight of trust, and each returned it tenfold. Ezra found himself speaking softly to them in the evenings, recounting the day's work, not as command but as conversation, the rhythm of quiet companionship filling the barn where once only frost and shadow had lived. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, casting long pale shadows over the snow, Ezra stood in the doorway again. The barn glowed from within, hay rustling softly as the donkeys shifted for the night. He pressed a hand to the weathered wood, remembering the morning when he had first opened the door and felt the presence of 8 animals waiting for him. He understood now, with a clarity that quiet mornings bring, that the story had never been about him alone. It had been about responsibility, endurance, and the quiet power of choice. Some lessons come only to those who refuse to give up, and Ezra had learned them in frost and silence, in the weight of bundles and the gaze of 8 unclaimed creatures. The truth had won not through anger or spectacle, but through steadfast attention, through the careful observation of evidence and the courage to act when no one else would. The ranch had become more than land or livestock. It had become a place of justice, redemption, and the steady rhythm of moral courage carried to its proper end. Ezra turned from the doorway, lantern in hand, and walked back into the barn. The donkeys looked up briefly, eyes calm and certain. Outside, the wind had softened. The frost no longer bit with the sharpness of fear. In the quiet warmth, the weight of the journey had been set down, carried only by those willing to bear it. Ezra knew that even after winter's cold receded, even after the courthouse's decree was settled into records, the barn would remain a beacon of the choices one man made when faced with suffering he could not ignore. He paused, hands resting lightly on the post, and whispered to no one in particular. Some beings survive by carrying the weight of others, until one person finally decides to carry it with them. And for the first time in many seasons, Ezra Cole believed he had.